A Long Walk to Water, Chapters 10, 11, and 12. Southern Sudan, 2008. The men finished their meeting. They all stood and walked past Naya's house. Naya joined the crowd of children following them. A few minutes' walk beyond her house there was a tree. The men stopped at the tree, and the strangers talked to Naya's uncle some more. There was another tree some 50 paces past the first one. With Naya's uncle beside him, one of the men stopped at the halfway point. The other man walked the rest of the way and examined the second tree. The first man called out to his friend in a language Naya didn't understand. The friend answered in the same language, but as he walked back towards the group, he translated for the chief, and Naya could hear them. This is the spot halfway between the two largest trees. We will find the water here. Naya shook her head. What were they talking about? She knew that place like the back of her own hand. It was there, between two trees, that the village sometimes gathered to sing and talk around the big fire. There wasn't a single drop of water on that spot unless it was raining. Southern Sudan, 1985. Salva reached for his gourd. He knew it was to be half full, but suddenly it felt much lighter, as if there was hardly any water left in it. Uncle Jor must have guessed what he was thinking. No, Salva, he murmured. You are too small and not strong enough yet. Without water, you will not survive the rest of the walk. Some of the others, they will be able to manage better than you. Sure enough, there was now 3 women giving water to the men on the ground. Like a miracle, the small amounts of water revived them. They were able to stagger to their feet and join the group as they walking continued. But their 5 dead companions were left behind. There were no tools with which to dig, and besides, burying the dead men would take too much time. Sal tried not to look as he walked past the bodies, but his eyes were drawn in their direction. He knew what would happen. Vultures would find the bodies and strip them of their rotting flesh until there were only the bones remaining. He felt sick at the thought of those men, first dying in such a horrible way, and then having even their corpse ravaged. If he were older and stronger, would he have given water to those men, or would he, like most of the group, have kept his water to himself? It was the group's 3rd day in the desert. By sunset they would be out of the desert, and after that it would not be far to Intanga, a refugee camp in Ethiopia. As he trudged through the heat, Salvo finally had a chance to talk to Uncle about a worry he had been growing like a long shadow across his thoughts. Uncle, if I'm in Ethiopia, how will my parents ever find me? When will I be able to go back to Lone Akeem? I have talked with the others here, Uncle said. We believe that the village of Lone Akeem was attacked and probably burned. Your family, Uncle paused and looked away. When he looked back again, his face was solemn. Sala, few people survived the attack on the village. Anyone still alive would have fled into the bush, and no one knows where they are now. Salva found silent for a moment. Then he said, At least you will be there with me in Ethiopia. Uncle's voice was gentle. No, Salva. I'm going to take you to the refugee camp, but then I will return to Sudan to fight the war. Salva stopped walking and clutched his uncle's arm. But, Uncle, I will have no one. Who will be my family? Uncle gently loosened Salva's grip so he could take the boy's hand in his. There will be many other people in the camp. You will become friends with some of them. You will make a kind of family there. They, too, will need people they can depend on. Salva shook his head, unable to imagine what life would be in the camp without Uncle. He squeezed Uncle's hand tightly. Uncle stood quietly and said nothing more. He knows it will be hard for me, Salva realized. He doesn't want to leave me there, but he has to go back and fight for our people. I mustn't act like a baby. I must try to be strong. Salva swallowed hard. Uncle, when you go back to Sudan, you might meet my parents somewhere. You could tell them where I am. Or you could talk to those you meet and ask where the people of Lone Kia are now. Uncle did not answer right away. Then he said, Of course I will do that, nephew. Salvo felt a tiny spark of hope. With Uncle looking for his family, there was a chance they might all be together one day. No one in the group had eaten anything for 2 days. Their water was nearly gone. Only the vision of leaving the desert kept them moving through the heat and the dust. Early that afternoon they came across the first evidence that the desert was receding, a few stunted trees near a shallow pool of muddy water. The water was unfit to drink, but a dead stork lay by the pond's edge. Immediately the group began to make preparations to cook and eat the bird. Salva helped gather twigs for a fire. As the bird roasted, Salva could hardly keep his eyes off of it. There would be enough for a bite or two for each person, but he could hardly wait. Then he heard loud voices. Along with the rest of the group, he turned and saw 6 men coming towards them. As the men approached, he could see that they were armed with guns and machetes. The men began shouting, "Sit down! Hands on your heads! All of you, now!" Everyone in the group sat down at once. Sal was afraid of the weapons. He could see the others were too. One of the men walked among the group and stopped in front of Uncle. Salva could tell by the ritual scarring on the man's face that he was from the newer tribe. "Are you with the rebels?" the man asked. "No," Uncle answered. "Where have you come from? Where are you going?" "We come from the west of the Nile," Uncle said. "We are going to Antang, to the refugee camp." The man told Uncle to get up and leave his gun where it was. 2 of the men took Uncle to a tree several yards away and tied him to it. Then the men moved among the group. If anyone was carrying a bag, the men opened it and took whatever was in it. They ordered some people to remove their clothing and took that too. Salva was trembling. Even in the midst of his fear, he realized that for the first time on the trip, it was a good thing to be the youngest and smallest. The men would not be interested in his clothes. When the men had finished their looting, they picked up Uncle's gun. Then they walked to the tree where Uncle was tied up. Maybe they will leave us alone now that they have robbed us, Salva thought. He heard them laughing. As Salva watched, one of the men aimed his gun at his uncle. 3 shots rang out, then the men ran away. Chapter 11, Southern Sudan, 2008. After the 2 men left the village, the task of clearing more of the land between the trees began. It was very hard work. The small trees and bush had to be burned or uprooted. The long grass had to be sickled and hoed under. It was dangerous work too, as poisonous snakes and scorpions hid in the grass. Now I was still making the 2 daily trips to the pond. Each time she returned, she could see that slowly but surely the patch of cleared earth was growing larger. The earth was dry and rock-hard. Now I felt puzzled and doubtful. How could there be water in such a place? And when she asked Depp that question, he shook his head. She could see the doubt in his eyes too. Southern Sudan and Ethiopia, 1985. They buried Uncle in a hole about 2 feet deep, a hole that had already been made by some kind of animal. Out of respect for him, the group walked no more that day, but took time to mourn the man who had been their leader. Salva was too numb to think, and when thoughts did come to him, they seemed silly. He was annoyed that they would not be able to eat after all. While the men had been looting the group, more birds had arrived and pecked at the roasted stork until there was nothing but bones. The time for grief was short, and the walking began again soon after dark. Despite the numbness in his heart, Salva was amazed to find himself walking faster and more boldly than he had before. Marshall was gone. Uncle was gone too, murdered by those newer men right before Salva's eyes. Marshall and Uncle were no longer by his side, and they never would be again. But Salva knew that both of them would have wanted him to survive, to finish the trip and reach the Etang refugee camp safely. It was almost as if they had left their strength with him to help him on his journey. He could not think of any other explanations for the way he felt. But there was no doubt beneath his terrible sadness he felt stronger. Now that Salva was without Uncle's care and protection, the group's attitude towards him changed. Once again, they grumbled that he was too young and small, that he might slow them down or start crying again, as he had in the desert. No one shared anything with him, neither food nor company. Uncle had always shared the animals and birds he shot with everyone in the group, but it seemed they had all forgotten that, for Salva now had to beg for scraps, which were given grudgingly. The way they were treating him made Salva feel still stronger. There is no one left to help me. They think I am weak and useless. Salva lifted his head proudly. They are wrong, and I will prove it. Salva had never before seen so many people in one place at the same time. How could there be this many people in the world? More than hundreds, more than thousands, thousands upon thousands. People in lines and masses and clumps. People milling around, standing, sitting, or crouching on the ground. Lying down with their legs curled up because there was not enough room to stretch out. The refugee camp at Intang was filled with people of all ages, men, women, girls, small children, but most of all the refugees were boys and young men who had run away from their villages when the war came. They had run because they were in double danger from the war itself and from the armies on both sides. Young men and sometimes even boys were often forced to join the fighting, which was why their families and communities, including Salva's headmaster, had sent the boys running into the bush at the first sign of fighting. Children who arrived at the refugee camp without their families were grouped together, so Salva was separated at once from the people he had traveled with. Even though they had not been kind to him, at least he had known them. Now among strangers once again, he felt uncertain and maybe even afraid. As he walked through the camp with several other boys, Salva glanced at every face he passed. Uncle had said that no one knew where his family was for certain, so he wasn't there at least a chance that they may be here in the camp. Salva looked around at the masses of people stretched out as far as he could see. He felt his heart sink a little, but he clenched his hands into fists and made himself a promise. If they are here, I will find them. After so many weeks of walking, Salva found it strange to be staying in one place. During that long, terrible trek, finding a safe place to stop and stay for a while had been desperately important. But now that he was at the camp, he felt restless, almost as if he should begin walking again. The camp was safe from the war. There was no men with guns or machetes, no planes with bombs overhead. On the evening of his very first day, Salva was given a bowl of boiling maize to eat, and another one in the morning. Already things were better here than they had been during the journey. During the afternoon of the second day, Salva picked his way slowly through the crowds. Eventually he found himself standing near a gate that was the main entrance to the camp, watching the new arrivals enter. It did not seem as if the camp could possibly hold any more, but still they kept coming, long lines of people, some emancipated, some hurt or sick, all exhausted. As Salva scanned the faces, a flash of orange caught his eye. Orange! An orange headscarf! He began pushing and stumbling past people. Someone spoke to him angrily, but he did not stop to excuse himself. He could only still see a vivid spot of orange. Yes, it was a headscarf. A woman's back was to him. But she was tall, like his mother. He had to catch up. There were too many people in the way. A half-sob broke free from Salva's lips. He mustn't lose track of her. Chapter 12, Southern Sudan, 2009. An iron giraffe. A red giraffe that made very loud noises. A giraffe was a tall drill that had been brought to the village by two men who had visited earlier. They had returned with a crew of 10 more men and 2 trucks, one hauling the giant drill along with other mysterious equipment, and the other loaded with plastic pipe. Meanwhile, the land was still being cleared. Naya's mother tied the baby on her back and walked with several other women to a place between the village and the pond. They collected piles of rocks and stones and tied them up into bundles using sturdy cloth. They bounced the bundles of rocks onto the ground, bundles on their heads, and walked back to the drilling site and emptied the rocks onto the ground. Other villagers, using tools borrowed from the visitors, pounded the rocks to break them up into gravel. Many loads of gravel would be needed. Naya didn't know why. The piles of gravel grew larger each day. The clander of the machines and the hammers greeted Naya each time she returned from the pond. Unfamiliar noises that mingled with the voices of the men shouting and women singing. It was the sound of people working hard together, but it did not sound at all like water. A Tang refugee camp, Ethiopia, 1985. Mother, mother, please! Sava opened his mouth to call out again, but the words did not come. Instead, he closed his mouth, lowering his head, and turned away. The woman in the orange headscarf was not his mother. He knew this for certain, even though she was still far away and had not seen her face. Uncle's words came back to him. The village of Lunaca was attacked, burned. Few people survived. No one knows where they are now. In that moment, before calling out the woman a second time, Salvo realized that Uncle had truly meant something Salvo had known in his heart for a long time. His family was gone. They had been killed by bullets or bombs, starvation or sickness. It did not matter how. What mattered was that Silva was on his own now. He felt as though he was standing on the edge of a giant hole, a hole filled with black despair of nothingness. I'm alone now. I am all that is left of my family. His father, who had sent Silva to school, brought him treats like mangoes, trusted him to take care of the herd. His mother, always ready with food and milk and a soft hand to stroke Salva's head. His brothers and sisters, whom he had laughed with and played with and looked after. He would never see them again. How can I go on without them? But how can I not go on? They would want me to survive, to grow up and to make something of my life, to honor their memories. What was it that Uncle had said during the first terrible day in the desert? Do you see that group of bushes? You need only walk as far as those bushes. Uncle had helped him get through the desert that way, bit by bit, one step at a time. Perhaps Silva could get through life at the camp the same way. I need only to get through the rest of this day, he told himself. This day and no other. If someone had told Salva he would live in the camp for 6 years, he would never have believed it. 6 years later, July 1991. They are going to close the camp. Everyone will have to leave. That's impossible. Where will we go? That's what they're saying. Not just this camp, all of them. The rumors skittered around the camp. Everyone was uneasy. As the days went by, the uneasiness grew into fear. Sava was almost 17 years old now, a young man. He tried to learn what he could about the rumors by talking to the aid workers in the camp. They told him that the Ethiopian government was near collapse. The refugee camps were run by foreign aid groups, but it was the government that permitted them to operate. If the government fell, what would the new rulers do about the camps? When that question was answered, no one was ready. One rainy morning, as Salvo walked towards the school tent, long lines of trucks were arriving. Masses of armed soldiers poured out of the trucks and ordered everyone to leave. The orders were not just to leave the camp, but to leave Ethiopia. Immediately there was chaos. It was as if the people ceased to be people and instead became an enormous herd of panic-stampeding, two-legged creatures. Salvo was caught up in the surge. His feet barely touched the ground as he was swept along by the crowd of thousands of people running and screaming. The rain, which was falling in torrents, added to the uproar. The soldiers fired their guns into the air and chased people away from the camp. But once they were beyond the area surrounding the camp, the soldiers continued to drive them onward, shouting and shooting. As he dashed ahead, Salvo heard snatches of talk. The river! They're chasing us towards the river. Salvo knew which river they meant. The Gallo River, which was along the border of Ethiopia and Sudan. They are driving us back to Sudan, Salvo thought. They will force us to cross the river. It was the rainy season. Swollen by the rains, the Gallo's currents would be merciless. It was the rainy season. Swollen by the rains, the Gallo's currents would be merciless. The Gallo was well known for something else too. Crocodiles.